Hello and welcome to the Pocket Dojo podcast, the show where we talk about making the world a better place by making better things. I'm Paul Crick.
And I'm Asha Singh.
Today, it's Asha's turn to lead the conversation, so let's dive in.
Today, I'm talking with Suzie Lewis, a woman leader and a fellow practitioner in organisational leadership and development. Suzie and I met a few years ago through a client that I was running a workshop for that Suzie was working with at the time. Suzie, welcome to the show, first of all.
Thank you, Asha. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. So, Suzie, I know you have many talents and many stories to share. So, rather than me trying to, frame that in a way that works for you, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself to begin our conversation and the work that you do to begin our conversation today?
I will do. I've definitely got stories, but I'll keep it short.
Great.
So let's start where you started, where we met. So I worked in a large organization for 20 years. It was great. I did lots. I had lots of impact. I met lots of really brilliant, funky people, and we did lots of really great projects. But I got bored. I got bored of a big machine. I got bored of being constrained. Not just for being constrained sake, but also just like not being able to have the impact I knew that I could have, and having to fit in to this culture and way of being that just wasn't me. And it took me a long time to actually sort of step up to that and then step out of the organization. So whilst I was in the organization, I did what I love doing, which is essentially people. So I used to do sports coaching at university and things like that. And I've always been in this space of helping people and supporting these deeper conversations between people. And, I have 3 sisters. They're my best friends. They're also inspirational to me, and we have these conversations all the time. So I was coming from that perspective when I walked into the corporate world. I was like, wow, what is this? So that's what I love doing. And I went through lean expert on the supply chain. I went through 10 or 12 years of HR. And then I ended up with the leadership topic, leadership university and digital transformation. But it's always been that human thread of how can people, I saw so much suffering in organizations. I also saw a lot of excitement and a lot of curiosity, but I saw quite a lot of suffering. And my first observation was, what is happening in this system? It doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel open. So for all those reasons, I stepped out and set up my own organization to carry on practicing what I was doing in the organization, but in a different way, and to see different organizations and different sizes of organizations, different industries, because my idea was that these are just complex, messy human problems, and it's just the context that changes. So I was interested and excited to see if other sizes of organization and industry had the same issues around leadership, ways of working, and thriving in an organization or not. So that's me. I live in France. I've been living here for 27 years, but I'm British, but I finished my studies here. I did my master's in cultural identity, which clearly fits into what I do today. So that's me, and that's what I do. And at the time we met, I wasn't particularly happy in my job. And I was already thinking, right, how can I change this? How can I do something to step out of something that doesn't fit me? So,
wonderful. Thank you. We have such rich stories, such rich paths that we've walked to come to the present day, isn't it? It's fantastic. So, Suzie, as you know, on the Pocket Dojo podcast, we're talking about, in particular, regenerative leadership and organizational development, which can look really different in different places. So, we have a broad, let's say, picture of what we think is useful, but part of the reason for bringing guests onto the second series of the podcast is really to see what it looks like, in the places that they move through, in the context they work in their own business or whatever the situation might be for them. So in a way, I think you've almost started to answer the question that I wanted to ask you with your introduction, which is great, which is what does regeneration look like for you in your work today? How is it important? Would you even describe it in that way?
So yes, it's definitely important. It's really important. And I think you can hear a little bit from my story that I've been doing regeneration for some time, but it wasn't conscious. So this is the important part of why it's important and why we need to make it conscious. I think it's important because it's a different mindset. I think it's important because we're struggling as a society, as a planet, and in organizations, of course. But, there are different concentric circles of this struggle going on. And we need to be able to have a more adaptive view and a more adaptive mindset as to what we do. And I'm putting that in inverted commas because there isn't just one way of doing things. And often we get locked into that, don't we? From education. Let's start with education.
Yeah.
That's different podcast, but yeah. And so I think it's really important. I put it into what I do, and I put it into what I do. And hindsight's a great thing, isn't it, Asha? But if I look back at what I've done today, I've always been putting it into what I do by explaining what regeneration means for me, why it's important. So if I just take, a translation into daily language, the systemic view of things is really important for me, because you cannot have regenerative practice if you don't understand the bigger picture. If I take business words, you don't understand the system. And so it's incredibly important, and particularly for leadership. So in organizations, which is where I spend most of my time, but leadership in general and self-leadership. If we can't look at things regeneratively, we're going to struggle individually and collectively to want to survive and to have any type of impact in our closer circles. So for those reasons, I think it's really important.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with that, for what it's worth. And you made a very valid point, though, when we're thinking about coming into this conversation about how do we stop it from becoming yet another buzzword? It's the next agile, it's the next, lean, it's the next whatever. I'm not making comments on the validity or impact of those particular approaches or whatever, but just that we don't make it, there are lots of, I've been thinking about the World Economic Forum or whatever, who've sort of jumped on this bandwagon. And I think, a lot of people working in the field of regeneration would have a number of questions about that, whether that's right or not. But, I think you made a really valid point. How do we stop it becoming yet another buzzword in our organizations?
And I think that is really the question, because often we take complex topics, like really complex, like regeneration, agile is complex to some extent, change is complex, and we're ticking a box in organization. We've done this. We need to know, we need to understand it. So I think, and we come up with inclusion. I work a lot in diversity, equity and inclusion. It's the same thing. I spend my time demystifying what inclusion means. And what it could mean for those people and the approach that you take to it. So I think you can stop it from becoming a buzzword by constantly doing three things. One, giving it meaning. So, okay, regeneration is used everywhere. This is what it means in this context for this strategy or this team. So giving it meaning, making it real. So let's take our language, let's take our pain points, let's take this project. This is what regenerative leadership looks like on this project, or regenerative or iterative. We could replace it with iterative in some ways of working, and constantly bringing people back down to earth on it, because otherwise you get stuck in regenerative this, agile this, design thinking this. And I spend my time on agile and design thinking also, giving agile a definition. Now clearly it's mine, so then it's interesting to see what theirs is, but defining what that means for us. It's a methodology. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of great research done around regeneration and regenerative models. You've got the donut economics. I went on a course on regenerative finance recently. It was absolutely fabulous. Just opened my mind.
Capital Institute.
Yeah, it was brilliant. And it was brilliant because it opened my mind, and it was brilliant because it connected lots of different subjects that maybe I wouldn't have connected to that. And it was brilliant because it gave definitions that we could then work with and agree with or not. But I think you need to do constantly this sense making, as opposed to just saying, oh, we're going to do regenerative leadership. Well, our definitions already, and we work in the same field, but probably quite different of that term. So constantly making it real and sense making around it for the context you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm struck by the fact that, from what you're telling me, there's just this, little kind of opening to the conversation that way, that there are lots of ways actually that we can help our leaders, to prepare for the kind of complexity. So first of all, that that link with complexity. Regeneration and complexity for me are, in a sense, kind of two ways of looking at the life through, or the world through, similar kind of lenses with similar kind of practices and concepts and, all the rest of it. So one of the things that I've often heard, leaders, particularly at the top of organizations, say, our systemic transformation takes too long and it's too difficult and we can't, be assured that we're going to get it right and all this kind of thing. But I'm just curious, from touching on particularly what you just said about, putting it very much into context. In your view, what are the best ways really that we can help our leaders to, prepare ourselves first of all, then our leaders and organizations, for more sustainable, more responsible kind of business that actually responds to the reality of life today and the complexity that they face?
So I think they're right. It is hard. It does take a long time and it is big. But I think we can help. I'm going to go back to something I just said, helping them by getting them to give their definition and helping them understand what those terms mean for them. And there will be strategic business top level objectives attached to that. Otherwise they wouldn't be looking at it. So what does that mean for them and how do they translate that strategy into sort of tactics or operations as they go is one thing. But I don't think the regenerative mindset or the adaptive mindset that they need will be there unless they start looking at themselves. And, self-awareness sounds trite. It is self-awareness, but it's what's happening in my inner system. How do I think? How do I feel? And why? Because you're going to need to revisit that all the time as you step through this journey, which, people say to me, systemic transformation, I mean change management. And for me, that's a yes and. It's not just change management. It's also leadership, knowing yourself, business innovation, your intentions and your interactions with other people. Because if I look at collaboration, for me, collaboration is the quality of conversations you're having. If I take it down to a human dimension. And all that is not the way we're necessarily wired, and it's not the way organizational culture is today. So like you said, they need to know. Well, we don't know either systemic or transformation. They're both areas where quite a lot needs to emerge. So that can be really scary. So I think we need to get them to understand what those topics mean for them.
Yeah.
And the human dimension of that is not only as a leader are you going to have to accept that you don't know, let things unfold and accept that maybe you don't have all the answers. You're also going to have to support other people in that. If I take it down to like simple, and that's really difficult because if you're struggling yourself or if you're tired and you're having to do something that isn't your go-to place, then it's really hard to help somebody else as well or hold a space for somebody else as well. So I think there are lots of programs that exist today with some elements of that, but my biggest regret is that they're not brought together in a way that makes sense for this topic, in a way that gives that holistic picture. And I think that would really help leaders understand the bigger picture, but also creating that permission collectively to not know.
Absolutely, which is, for most organizations, it's really challenging because people are employed to bring results in whatever way that, depends on the role in the organizational culture. They're basically there to get stuff done, they're not there to create, a system that feels like something that's natural and holistic and healthy. And for the most part, there are organizations that operate that way. And I guess it's also very linked to what the organization produces, in terms of products or services or whatever. And it's definitely easier to be organized in an ecosystem and to think about, give precedence to the quality of your conversations, whether if you're, for example, designing apps or, something digital, whatever, and if you're producing aircraft or satellites or, other forms of heavy industry, then that's definitely a challenging thing to do without a doubt. So I want to just pick up on a couple of threads there, Susie. So the first is very much about the importance of context. So making things come alive and have meaning, like you said, give meaning in a context so that people can see actually, there are simple things that we can do that can either sit alongside the traditional, business approaches like change management or agile methodology or, whatever it might be that an organization is using to get stuff done. And also that, it's not that difficult, actually. there's a lot of it that's really common sense. So, for example, in the first series of the podcast, Paul Crick, my co-host, and I, introduced, among other topics, a broad areas of regenerative practice that I can hear a lot of them, very much alive, let's say, in the stories that you're telling. So about nourishing relationships, about being able to tell the truth about what you're saying. So in other words, people making this real for themselves rather than an expert coming in from outside and saying it looks like this and it should be that, and whatever, which I think is beginning to lose its popularity in any case. Telling the truth, which is always really hard.
Really hard.
It's really hard to say, okay, this is really not working. We need to sort it out, but it's going to require, let's say, to use business language, a multifunctional team from across the organization. You might have very different views about stuff, and how do we create that quality of conversation so that we really can have, collaboration that's going to bring a positive impact and whatever. And then the other little thread that I want to pick up on is in this series of the podcast, we want to, as well as expand on the area of practice, like I said, when we began just now, but to also, the focus of our conversations is really thinking about who we bring of ourselves to situations. So I think you just used the expression, which I really like, about our inner system. Who am I when I am under pressure or in difficulty or up against, the wall, my back against the wall, whatever kind of metaphors we want to describe. How do I show up as an individual? How do I lead myself? Never mind whether I have a formal, position of leading or responsibility for leading others, but how do I lead myself to adapt to things particularly that I don't like? That's a very human quality. Why should I do something that, I think is bullshit, quite frankly?
Yeah.
And that happens a lot in organizations. And I think actually it gets worse as you rise up from my, witnessing of people's challenges and stuff, But the fact that, who do I bring of ourselves to any situation? And then what is actually possible in the spaces between us? So you said it's very much about context. It's very much about sense making. I'll just touch on one other point and then love to hear your thoughts. So about reframing, we all have challenges. There are really massive challenges in the world. They're really difficult to sort out because they're so entangled and they require kind of collaboration we're not used to, and blah, blah, blah. Never mind the money aspect of stuff. That's, different story, but money seems to flow when people are aligned on purpose and stuff like that, which is understandable, So the other thing is, about reframing what's actually possible with what we have. This blue sky ideal thinking, whatever, understandably frustrates a lot of executives and, people who need to get stuff done. So, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that, just broad areas of practice and simple things that people can do that can, either sit alongside what they're doing already. They don't have to turn the world upside down unless they particularly want to, but most organizations hate that, as we know. And as you say, and it's also about innovation. It's about all sorts of stuff,
But I mean, I don't think you can have innovation or regeneration, but innovation is like one of those buzzwords. I don't think you can have successful innovation if you don't understand who you are. So if you don't have that, I'm going to call it an inclusive environment, because for me, all practice starts with yourself. And it does start with understanding how you show up, how you get triggered and why, but also your deal with yourself of where your boundaries are and where your middle ground is as to how you're going to show up and what you will and won't accept. And not accepting something is not having a conflict, getting aggressive. It's just saying, no, that's not okay for me. And there's not enough of that in life in general, but let's go back to organizations. There's not enough of that in teams, in organizations, which means that there are constant tensions in teams because people don't express themselves on, I'm triggered, and you don't have to use those words, but on that's not okay for me, or I feel like you didn't listen to me, or I feel like my idea is not being heard. And I think that's the starting point for any innovation, any type of performance where people will also thrive, because we have performance. We know that we have quite a lot of high performance, but people are burning out. And it's not as black and white as that. But I think this whole part of who am I and how do I show up, and I'm going to step into that because that's what I believe is right, is really important. I think the second thing which you touched on is meeting people and systems where they're at. And so much excitement can be caused by that. You know, when you accept and you formalize, this is what we're really good at. This is what's really going to work. And there's lots of things we aren't good at, but how do we build on it? And people, you know, call me naive. I don't think it's not naivety. I'm a relentless optimist, and I like being a relentless optimist. I saw so much curiosity in the organization where I worked. We did so much experimentation, and it was hard. And there are people suffering, and I'm not belittling any of that. But if you meet people where they are and systems where they are, you can do really impactful things, even if you're not in a high position in the organization. And, you know, these key influences that I call them, they're all standing in who they are, and they're all wanting to do things differently. And therefore, they're going to go and connect with other people who want to do things differently. And that's the momentum that you get when you meet systems where they are, because you know what your constraints are. And that's where the innovation comes from. But unless you know how you react, you can't create those interactions. And you will get pushback from the system. And if you let your sort of reactive side come into it, it's going to be, oh, they're criticizing me again. They're not criticizing you. They're scared of what you may be trying to impact. And that reframe, so, you know, the learn, unlearn, relearn, or whatever, this adaptive mindset is key for navigating everything. But let's go back to organizational context, for navigating discussions with people who think differently from you. And if you don't have those discussions, you cannot innovate. So it all comes back to, as you said, who am I, Asha, and how do I show up? And if I don't show up the way I want to, that's my responsibility. Everyone has personal agency, however big the system.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You know, there's something really important. I think you actually used the expression or something very similar about stepping into your power. You know, standing in who you are and where your boundaries are, what you're really good at, what you're not good at, being able to be, you know, honest, to show vulnerability without it becoming a, you know, drama or anything like that. And just to say, okay, this is where, you know, we have grounds for improvement or whatever it might be. And then, you know, as you say, you connect with people who have a similar kind of approach to life, and that's where innovation begins, that kind of edge. There is a whole other direction we could go in, but we'll have that for another conversation. Just listening to you, I won't go there today. But it's just whether we, another day, come back, please. That's great. You know, do we bring most effective change in organisations from inside? So, you know, the people who are doing, just as you say, you know, connecting with, and I guess in a really big system like the one we were referring to earlier, that's probably easier than it is in a different kind of organization that might be more global or whatever. And it's also really connected to me to what, you know, organizations produce and create in terms of products, services, etc. But the other point, or, you know, or do we bring it from outside? Does a system really get, you know, stimulated to change from the edges? So from outside, bringing in lots of different things. Anyway, that's a conversation I think for another day. But keep on track with where we were planning to have this go with this one. So one area where perhaps you and I have different views, and that's actually not. It's quite related to my last point about, you know, from inside the system or from outside of it. So I haven't worked in organizations for years. I'm not a big tech fan, although of course I see the validity of it, whatever. And it's obviously, you know, digitalization, particularly AI and what have you, you know, are topics that can really polarize. That's not the purpose of our conversation today. But, you know, you made a really valid point about, you know, how do we, or where do we best leverage tech to help regeneration? So, you know, it's also something that we're keen to explore more in this series of the podcast, because there are lots of different views on it. And going back to the point, you know, very important point about everything is contextual. You know, what do you think, Suzie, about how we best use what we have available today in terms of tech so that we really do regenerate?
So I think the tech is, whether we like it or not, part of life, and it's going to be a bigger part of life as it evolves. And so therefore, I can already see, let's take collaboration. You know, I can already see how it enables connection, digital connection, but also sometimes human connection. We've all lived through it in COVID. You know, the family that you can't see on the screen. You know, there is a human connection there. But I think as, you know, generative AI and these things move at, you know, a huge exponential speed, I think to come back to something we've already talked about, people are starting to get FOMO about these buzzwords, which is dangerous, because then they're like, oh, we need to create an AI strategy. What are we going to do for AI? What are we going to do for robotics? What are we... That isn't the point for me. The point is, what's the strategic business objective and how can tech enable us to get there? But because we're scared of not knowing, it gets pretty messy. So I think what keeps us relevant in a tech world is being human. And that sounds so trite. So let me just, it's the human capacities we have to connect. It's imagination, it's creativity, even though technology can now create. It's, I had this discussion on AI and coaching. What does it mean? And I said, okay, for me, it can't translate where the magic happens, which is the silence. So those type of things is where I think we can have a real impact as humans. So I think, one, we need to understand it. I keep myself up to date with tech. I'm not particularly techie, but I'm learning, because I think I need to learn to be able to understand the human part of that. So, and what that is going to bring to that equation. So constantly bridging that gap. And I think that's a level of what I do. But I also think at a business level, what is it going to come and enable? Does that mean a different platform model if I take it to organizations? Therefore, do I need to change my relationships and the way I work in my ecosystem and things like that? So, and then tech can enable other things. So if I take sort of leaner philosophy in terms of value streams, it can take away a lot of tasks that can now be automated and leave a place for more human-related, human-centered tasks. So, and I know that's an optimistic view, but I do think there is a lot of mileage in creating and underlining the human part. And as tech evolves, making sure that we understand what that tech means for humans, but also for the human system we're living and working in, whether it's a family, a community, or an organization. Here we're talking, or a society. Here we're talking about organizations. So I think I do follow tech, and I like to use it to enable things like collaboration, or to point out that even though they're on Microsoft Teams for 6, 7, 8 hours in a day, they're not collaborating. Consensus is not collaboration. Cooperation is not collaboration in my book. So that's a very interesting discussion, to keep the human side of it relevant, alive, and aware. So I think it's awareness on both sides and experimenting on both sides, not just trying out a new tool, or not just saying, well, let's train everyone in emotional intelligence, and then when they meet tech, it'll be fine. Or not.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, that's where we can definitely have an input. Whatever AGI, generative AI, does or doesn't do, we don't know what it's going to do. No. And in fact, on that point, I'm actually going to spend part of my summer this year in an AGI conference, which I've try and show up with. I've tried on other occasions and then gone at the last minute. Oh God, do I really have to do that? But I'm going to really try, because I totally, jokes apart, I totally agree with you that it's here, whether we like it or not, and so we better get as clued up as we can on all different aspects of it, and then how do we steward it? How do we steward it wisely? I'm not particularly of the movement of kind of AI for good and that kind of stuff. I think that's a different story, but that we have the wisdom to see tech in its right context, if I can use that expression. It's a set of tools that can help us do certain things really, really well that we're just never going to have the computational ability to be able to do. And when it starts to get generative, okay, well, a lot of that, from what I understand anyway, is about how it's been programmed, and the very human characteristics, qualities, values, priorities, biases, everything that makes humans that have gone into writing those algorithms in the first place, because that's what it's going to start building on. That's its kind of, that's its ABC, to make it very simple, which it's not. But it's ABC that it's going to build on and grow from. And I think we do, still have capacity, because it's not as intelligent as many of us would like to be afraid of, let's say, to start completely redesigning itself so far. At least that's the kind of the limits of my knowledge. But again, that's a whole other series of conversations there.
But I think just that's a really important point, is what we're feeding it with. So in terms of the representation of diverse profile schools of thought and all the diversity that exists in the human race, getting into that, if it's going to be generative, it's really important. And we have a duty and a responsibility there, each of us, to make sure that there are different people in the tech space who are creating the product set.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think, a lot of people are trying to influence as well. So, we've had a lovely introduction, let's say, to how you come to where you are now, and the kind of work you're doing. But I'm curious also, Susie, about you touched on some of them, but maybe we can just explore that a bit more. Some of the challenges you've had, as a woman leader in an organization and having your own business, whatever feels right for you to share with us. Some of the challenges that you've experienced along the way, and how you've, I was going to say overcome them, but I want to say more actually how you've transformed them into opportunities for learning, growth, whatever.
Yeah, and that's where thinking back, it is regenerative in itself, but I didn't realize it then. So I think my first challenge was myself, as ever.
Our worst enemies, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's blockers. Yeah. Get out your own way.
Yeah, understanding how to get out my own way. That was it. Understanding what was in my way, why I thought like that, what the reality may look like if I step back from some of that. So that whole growth process was my biggest challenge, and it's clearly a regenerative process, and it's never ending. I think the system was really challenging. And I'm going to add to that my third challenge, which was like the cultural layers of what I do. So, I live and work in a different country. The systems are very different. That was really challenging because it was just so far from what I thought, my perception, things like that. But particularly as a woman in a male-dominated environment, I got lots of challenges from the system, bias in the way things are done, bias in the systems in terms of promotions for women, hearing women, understanding the different points of view from the system and the way it works, and having to fit in. I just hated having to fit in, although I did it for a very long time and I learned a lot. So that was great.
Yeah.
And then I think fear of failure was my other challenge, which fits in with the narratives I had and how the system kept them going, or how I let the system keep them going, because there is personal agents in there. But that fear of failure, what if I fail? What if I fail? And somebody said to me one day, what if you're scared of success? And that was a pivotal moment for me. Clearly a very good friend, because I accepted what she said. It was like, yeah. Whereas if it was somebody who I felt judged by, I was like, what do you mean?
Wow.
Yeah, but that was a turning point for me, and very regenerative in the fact that, and I often ask myself the question, are you scared of success? What if it works and then you are out there and there's nothing else to do, type of thing. So those three areas were my main sort of challenge areas, and they continue to be so. And what I found that works for me, I now want to share with other leaders and organizations, which is part of my quest to sort of democratize access to this conversation, because I think it's the only way that you change cultures in organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. So what words of wisdom would you offer then to, people on a similar kind of path? So whether that's we know plenty of women leaders in common, and I'm sure they would all, in different ways, touch on the kind of things that you've shared as well. Wherever they are, whatever kind of organizations they're in, and that fear of failure is probably what drives them to keep them going. And I think about a couple of friends of mine who are still kicking ass at nearly 60, and I'm like, God, when are you going to get off the wheel? And good for you, but jokes apart, but I think that's very real. So what words of wisdom would you offer people who are on a similar path?
I think quieten your mind. I think stillness is the way you do more, and it sounds really paradoxical, but to quieten your mind and to look at your internal system. So the system you've just described of these women and my own system, we have systems for success. That system made me very successful. I just decided it was at my personal cost. So I think looking at the way you talk to yourself, the way you show up, and what that means for the way you treat yourself and your energy management. So starting there, quietening your mind and just thinking, okay, who am I? How does it work? Where really am I not being true to myself? This is horrible for me, but I'll do it anyway because it gets me to the top. Is that what you really want? And I think the what you want question is big, because people define success for you, particularly for women, societal norms. Success is defined somewhere and it's implicit until we make it explicit. And then we decide that it maybe is my definition of success or it's not my definition of success. So, when I first stepped out of the organization, the questions everyone asked me was, how many clients do you have? How much money are you making? And that was their definition.
They still ask me now, 20 years later.
Yeah, exactly. And that isn't my definition of success, or not only. So it took me a long time to get my head around that and to actually step out and say, okay, but that's not the only way I define success. There's also this and this. So I think being really sure about your values, who you are, and what your definition of success is, and that it doesn't need to be right or wrong. It's right for you. So then I think just stepping over yourself, fear. If it doesn't feel scary, it's not big enough. I don't think you ever get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. And if you're not feeling uncomfortable, you're not growing. So I think you're never going to sit there one day and go, I'm ready now. I'm going to step out of my organizer. I'm going to do this big project. You're always going to think, oh my God, what if it doesn't work? Or should I, shouldn't I? But do it anyway.
Of course.
Do it anyway. That would, go and speak to people.
Anyway.
Yeah, go and speak to people who have completely different perspectives and see what they think of you.
More great advice. I'm going to take some of it myself. And I guess there are we go through plateaus as well. I can definitely feel my whole body tells me when I'm growing, whether I like it or not.
Yes, exactly.
And sometimes I choose that direction of growth, and sometimes it just happens. I've got no control. It feels like I've got no control of it. Life just shapes us. Throws us into opportunities or situations where we have to grow and we have to adapt really quickly. So I totally agree with you. And then we definitely need rest. I definitely, particularly as I get older, I definitely need rest. I don't have the amount of energy or quality of energy available any longer to go, I'm going to go and do that, or I try this, or I've done plenty of that in mind, which I chose a very different path in life early on from going, I don't want to be an organizational leader. That's not I know I'm not going to fit, basically. And then finding places where I did, but anyway. So those are really valid pieces of words of advice. Thank you. So being true to yourself, isn't it? It's just knowing who you are, getting to know yourself, and we get to know ourselves better as we move through life, obviously. And we have to adapt to things and grow and see what happens as a result. And that's part of the richness and gifts that life has to bring, although it might not feel like that at the time, for many people, I'm sure. So we're coming towards the end of our conversation today, Susie, but just before we kind of close officially, let's say, I have a very short series of surprise or quick fire or whatever you want to call it questions that you haven't seen. There's nothing that's going to land you in a hole anywhere or anything like that. Would you play?
Of course I'll play.
Great. Stupid question, I know, but I thought I'd ask. So question number 1 is one non-negotiable, so something you need to do regularly, regenerative practice for you.
Pilates, my Pilates lessons. For lots of different reasons, but I will always find time every month to go to at least 2 Pilates lessons. Non-negotiable.
Great. It's like yoga for me, One thing, in some ways, it seems as I always ask this at the end of a conversation with people who've just told us amazing stories about what they've done and whatever. So it feels like in some way a kind of slightly redundant question. I'm going to ask it anyway. So one thing you change about yourself, Susie, or would like to still develop, whatever, so that you could have even greater impact than you do already?
I think I would like to have a greater mastery of stilling and quietening my mind. I've come a long way, but I've got quite a creative brain, and I can get into spaces where I can get to these narratives. I would really like to find new creative ways of intercepting those voices. So that's what I would change.
You're giving me loads of ideas about I should offer, so thank you. Unexpected gift of our conversation today. Okay, questions number 3 and question number 4 I'm going to put together. So someone who's really inspired you, and why?
My Nana. My Nana has really inspired me, and she stays with me all through my journey. Why? Because she knew who she was. She was very, very motivated, very feisty, but the generational openings weren't there for her to be able to use her talents, and therefore she helped us develop ours. And I just she played the piano. I'm a musician. She would accompany me in my music exams, and anything that she could give to me and my sisters, she would. And she was just a great role model for me.
Fantastic. I can see characteristics of her in you as well.
I have very fond memories of it. Yeah,
wonderful. It's amazing how many people say actually the same thing about their grandmother or their grandfather. for men, that other generation where we get,
Yeah.
you know, stuff that's different from our parents, of course. And then last but certainly not least, Susie, what's your biggest aspiration for the world?
My biggest aspiration for the world is a more distributed model, a more regenerative model. So where we can actually live in harmony, both with ourselves and the planet. And I know that sounds like a big blah, blah, but I think, you know, democratizing access to the type of skills for having deeper conversations and actually creating meaningful connections, creating regenerative finance models, regenerative economic models that will distribute food, money, and, you know, also help us sort of save the planet and make sure that we're living in a more equitable world is a big quest that I have, and that I feel that I'm contributing to at my own level. Even small things matter.
Yeah, they really do. Thank you. That's a beautiful place to bring our conversation to a close. I think, you know, lots of people are feeling and wanting to do the same thing. And there's something miraculous actually about the way that we're all finding each other and coming into this kind of conversation, and something, you know, for all the bad stuff that we can see happening around us and hoping that won't touch us personally, whatever, you know, there's so much amazing, miraculous life, you know, being born as well.
Absolutely.
Breaking down to breakthrough. Susie Lewis, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Please come back and join us another time. We'd love, there are all sorts of threads and
I definitely will.
avenues we could go down and whatever. So please let's do that another time. And thank you very much for your time and generosity today.
Thank you, Asha. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.